My wife spent 7 hours locked out of her own home in a freezing January storm. When I finally carried her inside, my son stood in the doorway with a drink in his hand and said, "We voted. This is not your house anymore. We already found you somewhere smaller." I did not argue. I did not beg. I looked at my son and said 2 words: understood. Goodbye. 4 days later, a man in a gray suit knocked on his door carrying something my son never knew existed. I am so grateful to have you here today. Before we unveil the truth, which city or country are you watching this story from? Please drop a comment below. Also, please note this story includes some fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or settings is purely coincidental, but the message I'm conveying to you is useful. The rain came down the way it only does in January sideways, and mean the kind that soaks through a coat before you've taken 3 steps from the car door. I had been sitting in the back of a cab for 40 minutes, watching the city blur past the fogged window, my phone dead in my coat pocket since mid-afternoon. The hospital had kept me longer than expected routine blood work and a follow-up scan that my cardiologist insisted on scheduling before the new year ran too far ahead. I had not thought to charge my phone before the appointment. I would spend a long time afterward wishing I had. The cab turned onto Sycamore Drive at 11:30, and I recognized the curve of the road, the way a man always recognizes the street where he has lived for 40 years. The oak trees along the sidewalk, the Henderson stone mailbox, the way the streetlight on the corner threw an orange circle onto the wet pavement. Everything exactly as it had always been. And then I saw the front porch. Eleanor was on the ground. She was not sitting. She was not leaning against the railing the way she sometimes did on warm evenings when she wanted air. She was on the floor of the porch, her back against the front door, her knees drawn up toward her chest, her gray cardigan soaked dark and pressed flat against her shoulders. Her head was tilted to one side. From the cab in the rain, with only the porch light above her, she looked small in a way that my wife of 43 years had never looked to me before. I told the driver to stop before we reached the driveway. I was out of the cab before it fully stopped moving. I am 71 years old, and I have not moved quickly in some years, but I crossed that lawn in the rain without feeling my legs at all. She was breathing. That was the first thing I checked, my fingers at her neck, my face close to hers. Shallow breaths, slow but there. Her skin was the temperature of the stone step beneath her. Her lips had gone pale, nearly gray in the porch light, and when I pressed her hand between both of mine, I felt nothing push back. Eleanor. I said her name the way I have said it 10,000 times, the particular way a man says his wife's name when he needs her to hear him more than anything else in the world. Eleanor, I'm here. Her eyelids moved. Not much, but they moved. The front door opened. Julian stood in the doorway in a dry shirt and a pair of house slippers, a glass of bourbon in his right hand backlit by the warm light of the entryway. He looked down at his mother on the porch floor, then up at me, and the expression on his face was not alarm. It was not guilt. It was something closer to mild inconvenience, the look of a man whose evening has been interrupted by something he considers beneath his attention. Dad, he said, his voice smooth but tightly controlled. I didn't know she was out there. I thought she was upstairs. He took a slow sip of his drink, looking down at his mother with a chilling, emotional detachment. But since you're here, we should talk. The family agreed it's time for a fresh arrangement. This house simply works better without the two of you in it. I kept my eyes on his face. I did not look away. In 40 years of delivering verdicts, I had learned that the man across from you will always tell you more if you let the silence sit for one beat longer than is comfortable. Julian filled it the way guilty men always do. It's not personal, it's practical. You and Mom would be more comfortable somewhere smaller, somewhere easier to manage. We found a nice place over in Cedar Brook, one of those assisted living communities with the garden views and the shuttle service. He took a slow sip of his drink. Chloe's already looked at the brochures. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting the cold concrete the way they always did in January. I straightened my coat. I looked at my son, this man I had brought into the world and raised in this house, this man who was standing warm and dry in his house slippers, while his mother lay unconscious at his feet, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger. Something much quieter than anger. Something that had been waiting a long time to find its proper shape. Understood, I said. Goodbye, Julian. His expression shifted. He had been expecting argument. I could see it in the slight forward lean of his shoulders, the prepared posture of a man ready to defend a position. My 2 words gave him nothing to push against, and I watched the confidence in his face flicker for just a moment, like a light on a circuit that had suddenly lost power. I bent down and gathered Eleanor carefully, one arm beneath her knees and one behind her back, the way I had carried her across the threshold of this same house 43 years ago, when we were young, and the future stretched out ahead of us without a single dark room in it. She was lighter than she should have been. That registered somewhere deep and quiet in my mind, a detail to be returned to later. I carried her to the cab. The driver, a young man named Marcus on his placard, had gotten out and was holding the door open without being asked. He did not say anything. He simply held the door and let me pass, and I was grateful for that more than I could have expressed. I settled Eleanor against my shoulder in the back seat. She stirred slightly, her hand finding my arm, her fingers pressing weakly against my sleeve. The cab pulled away from the curb, and I looked back once through the rear window. Julian was still standing in the doorway, watching us leave the bourbon glass at his side. The porch light framed him in yellow against the dark and wet night. I faced forward and did not look back again. My phone was dead, but Robert Vance's office number had been memorized for 30 years. I asked the driver if I could borrow his phone. He handed it back without a word. Robert picked up on the second ring the way he always did when he knew something was coming. "Robert," I said, "it's time. Open everything." There was a pause of exactly 2 seconds. Then, "I'll be ready by morning." I handed the phone back to the driver and looked down at Eleanor's face, pale and still against my shoulder, her breathing slowly steadying in the warmth of the cab. Outside, the rain kept falling sideways, angry and relentless the way it always did in January. I had been waiting 2 years for Julian to make this move. He had finally made it. And before the week was finished, he would understand that those 2 quiet words I had left on his doorstep were not a surrender. They were a verdict. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand who I am. Not who I was on that rainy night in January, standing on a wet lawn with my wife in my arms. I mean who I had been for the 40 years before that night, and what those 40 years had taught me about the particular way human greed moves through a family when the patriarch begins to slow down. My name is Arthur Sterling. For 38 years, I served as a judge in the federal court system, the last 11 of those on the United States Supreme Court, before I retired at 68, with my full faculties intact, and a filing cabinet full of opinions that younger law clerks occasionally cited in briefs they hoped I would never read. I had presided over cases involving corporate fraud, contested estates, inheritance disputes that turned brothers into strangers and daughters into adversaries over sums of money that would not have impressed either of them 10 years earlier. I had watched families come apart in my courtroom with a thoroughness that no divorce attorney could fully anticipate, because money does not simply divide a family. It reveals one. Eleanor used to say I brought the courtroom home with me. She did not mean it as a criticism, though she delivered it with the particular smile she reserved for observations that were both affectionate and accurate. What she meant was that I never fully stopped evaluating. A dinner conversation, a casual remark from a neighbor, the way someone held eye contact a beat too long or looked away a beat too soon. 38 years on the bench wires a man differently. You begin to see the architecture beneath the surface of things, the load-bearing walls that people build around their intentions and call personality. I had built a good life inside that house on Sycamore Drive. Eleanor and I moved in the spring of 1982, 3 years into our marriage, when she was pregnant with Julian, and the oak trees out front were young enough that you could see over their tops from the bedroom window. We painted the kitchen yellow because she wanted something that felt like morning, even on overcast days. I built the bookshelves in my study myself over the course of 2 weekends badly and with considerable profanity, and Eleanor had laughed at every crooked shelf until I threatened to hire a carpenter. She said she preferred my crooked shelves because they had character. I never replaced them. Julian was born that October, and Thomas arrived 4 years later. And for a long time, the house on Sycamore Drive was exactly what a house is supposed to be, which is to say, it was loud and imperfect, and full of the ordinary texture of a life being lived without too much self-examination. I watched my 2 sons grow up with the particular attention of a man who understood that character is not announced, it is demonstrated. Julian was charming from the time he could speak, the kind of child who knew instinctively how to read a room and position himself favorably within it. Teachers adored him. Neighbors called him polite. He was the first one to offer help when company came over carrying bags from the car and holding doors open with a smile that made adults exchange approving glances above his head. But I noticed things that approving adults did not. I noticed that Julian always offered to carry the heaviest bag only when someone was watching. I noticed that he shared his toys with Thomas precisely when an adult was present to register the generosity and reclaimed them quietly afterward. I noticed that when he was 12 and we gave both boys a small weekly allowance, Julian spent 3 weeks calculating how to get Thomas to trade chores before the older boy simply declared the arrangement unfair and took the better end of it by social force rather than negotiation. Thomas never seemed to notice, or if he did, he absorbed it, the way good-natured younger siblings sometimes absorb the sharp edges of an older one, which is to say, with a patience that looked like obliviousness, but was in fact something more considered. I said nothing about what I observed. A father who announces his suspicions turns them into self-fulfilling accusations, and I had seen enough of that in family court to know better. I told myself that Julian's instincts were not yet character, that a boy who managed impressions was not necessarily a man who would exploit them, that adulthood had a way of burning off the more calculated tendencies of a competitive child. I was not wrong about adulthood burning things off. I was wrong about which direction the burning went. Julian grew into a man who was successful in the way that certain people are successful, which is to say, aggressively, and with a particular talent for ensuring that credit flowed toward him and accountability flowed elsewhere. He married Chloe at 32, a woman with sharp eyes and sharper instincts about money, and together they built a life that looked prosperous from the outside and ran on a combination of Julian's income and a series of business loans that required a co-signer with sufficient assets to satisfy the lending bank. That co-signer was me on 3 separate occasions over 7 years, because Eleanor asked me to and because I told myself that a father who refused to help his son was not the kind of man I wanted to be. I signed each time. I noted each time. And I filed the documentation with Robert Vance each time because 38 years on the bench had also taught me that generosity without records is simply generosity waiting to become a dispute. Thomas, meanwhile, had moved to Seattle at 26 and built an architectural firm from a 2-person operation into something that employed 40 people and designed buildings that occasionally appeared in the kind of magazines Eleanor kept on the coffee table. He called every Sunday without being reminded. He sent his mother flowers on her birthday, and on the anniversary of our wedding, and on random Tuesdays in November, when he said he had been thinking about her cooking. He asked nothing of me financially ever, and when I once offered assistance during a lean period in the firm's early years, he thanked me carefully and declined. I tell you all of this not to cast a verdict before the evidence is presented. I tell you because understanding what happened on Sycamore Drive requires understanding the foundation beneath it, the 40 years of observation and record-keeping and careful, patient love that made everything that followed not a reaction but a preparation. The night Eleanor lay on that porch, I was not improvising. I had been ready for 2 years, and the man who carried her to that cab was not a frightened husband acting out of desperation. He was a former Supreme Court judge who had spent his entire career making sure that when the right moment arrived, everything was already in place. Julian had made his move at last. Now it was mine. The decision came to me on a Tuesday morning in January of 2023. Sitting in the waiting room of Dr. Marcus Allen's clinic on Meridian Street, holding a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, and reading a laminated sign about the importance of annual cardiac screenings. Marcus had been our family physician for 22 years. He was 61, careful, and constitutionally incapable of small talk, which I had always considered his finest professional quality. He called me into his office and slid my most recent test results across the desk, with the expression he reserved for news that required framing before delivery. "Your heart is the same as it was last year," he said. "The arrhythmia is mild and manageable. The fatigue you've been reporting is real, Arthur, but it's the kind of fatigue a man your age manages with rest and reasonable behavior, not the kind that puts him in a hospital bed." "I know that," I said. "Then why—" Marcus said, leaning back in his chair and looking at me the way he had looked at me for 22 years, which was directly and without any particular softness. "Did you ask me last week whether your symptoms could be described as progressive to someone who wasn't reading your chart?" I set the coffee cup down. "Because I need someone who isn't reading my chart to believe they are," I told him. I told him about Julian's 3 phone calls in the 6 weeks since Thanksgiving, each one warmer and more solicitous than the last. Each one finding a way to ask about the house, about my plans, about whether Eleanor and I had considered simplifying. I told him about the afternoon Julian had driven out to Sycamore Drive unannounced and spent 40 minutes walking slowly through the downstairs rooms, with his hands in his pockets, and his eyes moving across the ceilings, and the crown molding, with an expression I recognized from the bench. The expression of a man calculating what something is worth before he has formally decided to pursue it. I told Marcus that I had watched this particular pattern unfold in family court more times than I could accurately count, and that I had no intention of becoming one of my own cautionary tales. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued most about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, his fingers still pressed together, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. "What you're describing," he said carefully, "is deceiving your son about the state of your health. I'm describing allowing my son to believe a version of my health that isn't entirely inaccurate," I said. "My heart does have an arrhythmia. I do experience fatigue. I'm not manufacturing a condition, Marcus. I'm declining to correct an assumption." That's a very judicial distinction. I've had a lot of practice. He looked at me for the long moment, his jaw working slightly, the way it did when he was turning something over thoroughly before committing to a position. "And Eleanor?" he asked. "Does she know?" "She will tonight," I said. "I wanted to speak with you first." Marcus stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the parking lot, the way a man looks at something he isn't actually seeing. "I won't falsify records," he said finally. I won't document anything that isn't true. I'm not asking you to, I said. I'm asking you to document exactly what is true, thoroughly and consistently every week if possible. My actual condition accurately recorded with your professional assessment of my cognitive function included each time. He turned from the window. Why the cognitive assessments? Because when Julian eventually tries to argue that his father wasn't of sound mind when he made his financial arrangements, I said, I want 26 weeks of your signature on paper that says otherwise. Something shifted in Marcus Allen's expression then. Not agreement exactly, but the particular look of a careful man who has just understood the full architecture of what he's been shown and found it, despite his reservations, to be structurally sound. Every Tuesday, he said. Same time. Every Tuesday, I confirmed. That evening, I sat with Eleanor at the kitchen table, the one we had eaten at for 40 years. Beneath the light fixture she had picked out at a hardware store in 1984 and refused to replace because she said it still worked perfectly and she saw no reason to fix what wasn't broken. I told her everything. I told her about Marcus, about the weekly appointments, about what I suspected Julian was moving toward, and what I intended to do about it. She listened the way she always listened, with her hands wrapped around her tea mug and her eyes steady on my face. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. You think he'll try to take the house? She said. It was not a question. I think he's already decided to, I said. I just don't think he knows yet how he'll do it. Eleanor set her mug down carefully. Her hands were steady. Then we'd better make sure we're ready before he figures that out. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. Outside, the January wind moved through the oak trees on Sycamore Drive, and somewhere down the block, a neighbor's porch light flickered twice and went still. The next morning, I called Robert Vance. Robert Vance had been my attorney for 31 years, and in that time I had watched him build a reputation in estate law that made younger attorneys nervous when his name appeared on the opposing side of a filing. He was 70 years old, trim and precise, with the kind of unhurried manner that people sometimes mistook for slowness until they realized he had already finished thinking through something they had not yet begun to consider. His office on Callaway Street smelled of old paper and decent coffee, and the bookshelves behind his desk held more annotated volumes than most law school libraries. He listened to everything I said without writing a single note, which was his way of telling me he was taking it seriously. When I finished, he set his coffee cup down and looked at me across the desk. You want to restructure the entire ownership of the house, he said. I want to make it impossible for Julian to take it, I said. Those are related but not identical objectives. Robert almost smiled. Walk me through what you're thinking. I had spent 3 months thinking through exactly this, the way I used to think, through a complex opinion, turning it from every angle, testing each load-bearing assumption against the most aggressive challenge I could construct. I laid it out for him methodically. The house would be transferred entirely into Eleanor's name through a properly executed deed, removing it from any asset pool Julian might attempt to claim a share of through legal pressure or manufactured guardianship proceedings. Simultaneously, we would establish an irrevocable protective trust with Eleanor as primary beneficiary and both Thomas and myself as co-trustees. Irrevocable, Robert said, and his tone carried the particular weight attorneys give to words that clients sometimes choose without fully understanding their permanence. Once it's done, Arthur, it cannot be undone. Not by you, not by Eleanor, not by anyone without a court order showing fraud or incapacity. I know what irrevocable means, Robert. I know you do, he said. I'm saying it for the record, because in 31 years I have learned that even the most careful people need to hear certain words spoken out loud before they sign them. He paused. The trust cannot be challenged on competency grounds. That's where Marcus comes in. I said, and I explained the weekly assessments, the documented record of cognitive function that Marcus Allen had been building since January, each appointment time-stamped and signed and stored in a separate file that Robert would maintain independently of my medical records. By the time we execute the trust documents, I will have 40 weeks of a board-certified physician's written confirmation that I understood precisely what I was signing. Robert was quiet for a moment, his fingers pressed flat against the desk surface, his eyes moving across some middle distance that I recognized as the place where careful men go when they are checking a structure for weaknesses. "The protective clause," he said finally. "You want language that triggers automatically if Eleanor is excluded from the property." "I want language with teeth," I said. "Not a suggestion, not a warning, an automatic consequence." Robert pulled a yellow legal pad from his drawer and uncapped his pen for the first time since I had walked in. "Define exclusion," he said. "Any action that prevents Eleanor from entering, residing in, or freely using the property. Any removal of her personal belongings without her consent. Any financial pressure applied to force her departure. Any physical or documented pattern of conduct that a reasonable person would recognize as designed to push her out." I leaned forward slightly. I have spent 4 decades watching people find creative ways to do ugly things to each other within the technical boundaries of the law. I want this clause written by someone who has read the same case files I have. Robert wrote for nearly 2 minutes without looking up. When he stopped, he reviewed what he had written, crossed out one phrase, rewrote it, and looked up. "If the clause is triggered," he said, "what do you want to happen?" "The property transfers to Thomas immediately," I said. "Julian receives nothing, and whoever triggered the clause has 30 days to vacate." "And if Eleanor herself triggers it accidentally?" "Eleanor won't," I said, "but build in a trustee review period of 72 hours before any transfer executes. That gives Robert Vance enough time to confirm the facts before anything becomes irreversible." He nodded slowly, making another note. The clock on his bookshelf marked the seconds in the particular way that old clocks do, unhurried and indifferent to the weight of what was being decided beneath them. "One more thing," I said. "Thomas needs to know. Not the details, not yet. But he needs to know that something is being prepared and that I may need him later." "How much later?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "That depends entirely on how long it takes Julian to stop pretending and start moving." Robert capped his pen and looked at me across the desk with the expression of a man who had spent his career watching families navigate the worst versions of themselves. "You know, this document may never need to be used," he said. "I know," I said. "I built my entire career on preparing for outcomes I hoped would never arrive." I stood and buttoned my jacket. That's exactly why I was good at it. I signed the first set of documents 3 weeks later on a Thursday afternoon in November, with Marcus Allen's most recent assessment, dated the same morning, sitting on Robert's desk beside the trust instrument. Every page, every clause, every consequence exactly as I had specified. The trap was set. All it needed now was for Julian to walk into it himself. They arrived on a Saturday morning in March, which I had always considered the cruelest month for unwanted arrivals when the winter has not quite finished, and the ground is still too cold to feel like anything has genuinely begun. Julian pulled his SUV into the driveway at 9:30, and Chloe stepped out before the engine had fully stopped, shading her eyes with one hand and looking up at the front face of the house, the way a contractor looks at a property before submitting a renovation bid. She was 41, dark-haired, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested she considered her appearance a professional asset rather than a personal one. She had always been polite to Eleanor and me, in the particular way that people are polite when they have decided that politeness costs them nothing and might eventually pay a dividend. In 7 years of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, I had never once heard her say anything that could be used against her. I had always found that more unsettling than rudeness. "This place has such good bones," she said to no one in particular, still looking at the roofline. Julian came around from the driver's side and stood beside her, his hands in his jacket pockets, and the two of them looked at the house together for a moment, with an expression of shared assessment that made the back of my neck go cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the March air. Eleanor had made coffee and set out a plate of the lemon cookies Julian had liked since childhood. She stood in the kitchen doorway and smiled when they came inside because Eleanor had always believed that warmth was the correct opening position in any difficult situation, and because she trusted me, and because she knew that whatever happened in the weeks ahead, the ground beneath us was more solid than Julian could possibly imagine. "We thought the back bedroom would work best for us," Chloe said, before she had finished taking off her coat. "It has its own bathroom, and the morning light is better. We'd need to move a few things around, but nothing major." The back bedroom was the one Eleanor used for her sewing and her reading the room, where she kept the cedar chest that had belonged to her mother and the small writing desk where she answered her correspondence by hand, because she had never trusted email with anything she actually meant. Eleanor's smile did not waver. "Of course," she said. "Whatever makes you comfortable." I watched Chloe move through the downstairs rooms with her coffee cup, pausing in doorways, running one hand lightly along the kitchen counter, the way someone tests a surface they are considering replacing. Julian followed a half-step behind her, and I noticed that he waited for her assessments before forming his own, which told me something useful about the actual architecture of their partnership. In my study, Chloe stopped in front of my bookshelves and tilted her head slightly. "All these books," she said, with the particular tone people use when they mean something other than what they are saying. "It must be a lot to keep dusted." "I manage," I said. "We were thinking," Julian said, stepping forward in the way he always did when Chloe had opened a door he wanted to walk through, "that you might be more comfortable if this room had a bit less in it. Somewhere to rest during the day, maybe. A chair, a television. Something easier." I looked at my son standing in front of the shelves I had built with my own hands 40 years ago. The crooked shelves that Eleanor had refused to let me replace because she said they had character, and I felt something move through my chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "I'll think about it," I said. That evening, after Julian and Chloe had gone to a restaurant for dinner, without asking whether we would like to join them, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. The home security system I had installed 6 weeks earlier ran on a separate encrypted server that routed its footage directly to Robert Vance's office. 14 cameras covering every common area of the house, motion-activated with a backup battery that would keep recording for 72 hours, even if the main power was cut. I had told Eleanor about the cameras. I had told no one else. I opened the monitoring application and watched the thumbnail feeds for a moment. The empty kitchen, the quiet hallway, the front porch still holding the last gray light of the March evening. Everything still. Everything waiting. I thought about the way Chloe had looked at the roofline that morning, and about Julian's hands in his pockets, and about the lemon cookies Eleanor had made that sat mostly uneaten on the plate, because neither of them had thought to take one. I closed the laptop and picked up the phone. "Robert," I said when he answered, "the cameras are running. Tell your server to start logging from tonight." "Already done," Robert said. "I turned on the archive function this morning when you texted me they had arrived." I set the phone down and looked at the bookshelves across the room, at the 40 years of case files and legal texts, and annotated opinions that Julian had suggested replacing with a television and a reclining chair. The hunt, I thought, had officially begun. I had moved into a suite at the Hargrove Inn on Pembroke Avenue 2 weeks after Julian and Chloe arrived, telling Julian that the noise of another household made it difficult for me to sleep, which was partially true. The fuller truth was that I could not watch what was happening inside my own house from inside my own house without doing something I would later be unable to defend in a courtroom. 40 years on the bench had taught me that the most dangerous place for a man with a temper is the same room as the thing that is making him angry. Distance was not cowardice. Distance was strategy. Every evening at 7, I opened my laptop in the small desk chair by the hotel window and reviewed the previous 24 hours of footage from the 14 cameras on Sycamore Drive. Robert had set up the monitoring application so that motion events were flagged and time-stamped automatically, each clip labeled with the camera number and the date filed into folders that his paralegal organized and backed up to a secure server every morning at 6. By the end of May, we had enough documented incidents to fill a filing cabinet. By the end of August, we had enough to fill 2. The footage was not dramatic. That was what made it so devastating to watch. It was Eleanor standing at the kitchen counter at 6:45 in the evening, lifting the lid of the pot she had left simmering and finding it empty because Chloe had served dinner for herself and Julian at 6 and not called Eleanor down or set a plate aside. It was Eleanor eating crackers and cold soup from a can at the kitchen table, while the sound of Julian and Chloe's television drifted down from the living room. It was Eleanor counting the bills in her small brown wallet at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, smoothing each one flat with her thumb, her lips moving slightly as she added them up, because Julian had informed her the previous week that household expenses needed to be consolidated, and her personal account had been moved to a joint arrangement for convenience which had reduced her accessible cash to $40 a week. $40 a week for a woman who had managed her own finances with perfect competence for 43 years. I watched that clip 4 times. My hands were shaking by the third. In June, Julian cleared my study completely. The footage showed him and Chloe carrying boxes to the garage over the course of a Saturday afternoon, Julian moving with the brisk efficiency of a man who had been wanting to do this for some time and was enjoying the fact that no one was there to stop him. My annotated case files, 38 years of personal legal notes that I had indexed by hand, went into garbage bags. The framed citation from the American Bar Association that had hung above my desk since 1994 ended up propped against the garage wall beside a broken lawn chair. The bookshelves I had built, the crooked ones Eleanor had loved, were disassembled with a cordless drill and stacked in the recycling. I photographed every frame of that footage, printed each one, and delivered the prints to Robert in a manila envelope the following Monday morning. "Arthur," Robert said, looking at the prints spread across his desk, his voice carrying a flatness that I recognized as the sound of a careful man containing his reaction. "This is financial elder abuse under California statute. The joint account manipulation alone constitutes a documented violation." "I know what it constitutes," I said. "I'm not ready to move yet." Robert looked at me across his desk. "How much more do you need?" "I need him to make a move I can't defend him from," I said. "Something unambiguous, something that no attorney he could ever hire would be able to reframe as a misunderstanding or a family disagreement." I straightened the prints into a neat stack and slid them back into the envelope. "Julian is careful in the way that people are careful when they think they are the smartest person in the room. He'll give me what I need. I just have to be patient enough to let him." Robert was quiet for a moment. The window air conditioner hummed in the corner of his office. "Eleanor is the one paying the price for your patience," he said. The words landed the way he meant them to, squarely and without softening. I sat with them for a moment before I answered. "I know that," I said. "I speak with her every day. She understands what we're doing, and she has chosen to continue. That choice is hers, Robert, not mine. I will not make it for her." He nodded slowly and said nothing further on the subject because he knew me well enough to know that I had already argued both sides of this question with myself more times than I could count, lying awake in the hotel room on Pembroke Avenue, listening to the traffic outside and thinking about Eleanor at the kitchen table with her $40 and her crackers and her unshakable patience. In October, the footage showed something that made me close the laptop and sit for a long time in the dark of my hotel room before I could open it again. Eleanor had dropped a glass in the kitchen, an ordinary water glass that slipped from her hand and shattered on the tile floor. Julian had appeared in the doorway within seconds, and the expression on his face was not concern. He stood over the broken glass and over Eleanor, who was kneeling carefully to pick up the pieces, and he said something that the audio captured clearly. "You need to be more careful," he said. "This isn't your kitchen anymore." Eleanor looked up at him from the floor, her hands full of broken glass, and her face held an expression that I had not seen on it in 43 years of marriage. It was the expression of a woman who was choosing in real time to swallow something that deserved to be said aloud. I called Robert the next morning. "How much longer?" he asked before I could speak. "Not long," I said. "He's getting comfortable. Comfortable men get careless." 3 months later, on a cold January evening, Julian Sterling got careless for the last time. We met at a place called Birchwood Coffee on Garland Street, 3 miles from Sycamore Drive, on a Thursday morning in October, when the maples along the sidewalk had gone the particular shade of red that Eleanor had always called honest, because she said it was the one time of year when trees stopped pretending to be anything other than what they were. She had told Julian she was going to the pharmacy. She had in fact gone to the pharmacy first, because Eleanor had never told a lie in her life that she did not immediately try to make partially true. I was already at the corner table when she walked in, the one farthest from the window, and I stood when I saw her come through the door, the way I had stood when she entered rooms for 43 years, not out of ceremony, but out of the particular reflex of a man who has never stopped being glad when his wife walks in. She looked thinner than she had in March. That was the first thing I registered, and it hit me the way a cold wave hits sudden and total before I had time to prepare for it. Her coat, a wool peacoat she had owned for 15 years and refused to replace because it still kept her warm, hung slightly differently on her shoulders than it used to. She moved carefully, the way people move when they have learned that the floor beneath them may shift without warning, but her eyes were clear. That was the second thing I registered, and it steadied me. She sat down across from me and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup I had ordered for her, black with 1 sugar, the same way she had been drinking it since 1987, and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and something I could only describe as resolve. "You look terrible," she said. "You look thin," I said. "Julian canceled my grocery account," she said. "I have been creative with what is in the pantry." She said it the way she said most difficult things, matter-of-factly, and without self-pity, as though the facts were simply facts, and emotion could be addressed separately later once the facts had been properly established. I reached across the table and covered her hands with mine. They were cold, despite the coffee cup. "Eleanor," I said, "tell me honestly, do you want to stop this?" She looked at me for a long moment. Outside, a car moved slowly down Garland Street, and the maple leaves came down in a slow scatter against the coffee shop window, red and gold, and entirely indifferent to the weight of what was being decided at the corner table. "Stop which part?" she asked. "All of it," I said. "We can move the process forward today. Robert has more than enough documentation. We don't have to wait for Julian to make his final move. I can call Robert right now, and we can have a notice at that house by the end of the week." Eleanor turned her hands over beneath mine and gripped my fingers with a firmness that surprised me. Her grip had always been stronger than people expected. "Arthur," she said, her voice carrying the particular steadiness that had anchored me through 38 years of difficult verdicts and late nights, and the particular loneliness of carrying things that you cannot share with anyone. Have you ever been wrong about a person? In 40 years on that bench, have you ever read someone incorrectly and paid for it later? I thought about it honestly. Twice, I said. 1989 and 2004. And how did those cases end? Badly, I said, because I moved before the evidence was complete. She nodded once slowly, the way she nodded when she had made a decision that she did not intend to revisit. Then we wait, she said. You have never been wrong about Julian. Not once since he was 8 years old, and you came home from work and told me that boy was going to spend his life taking things that didn't belong to him. She paused. I should have listened to you more carefully then. I'm listening now. Eleanor, you've lost weight. You're eating crackers for dinner. He told you the kitchen wasn't yours anymore. My voice came out rougher than I intended, and I stopped for a moment to bring it back under control. I can end this now. I know you can, she said. But you told me the difference between a good verdict and a great one is whether the wrongdoing is so clear that no one can ever argue it was something else. She squeezed my fingers. Let him be clear, Arthur. Let him be so clear that Thomas's children can read the court documents 50 years from now and understand exactly what kind of man Julian Sterling chose to be. I looked at my wife across that corner table in that ordinary coffee shop on Garland Street and felt something that I had felt very few times in my life, which was the particular humility of being in the presence of a courage that was quieter and more durable than my own. There is one more thing, I said. Thomas, he's been moving on the debt acquisition for 2 months now. He has 2 of the 3 creditors. I paused. He asked me to tell you that he thinks about you every day. Eleanor's eyes filled, then not spilling over, just filling the way a glass fills when you pour carefully right to the edge. She pressed her lips together for a moment and looked down at the table. When she looked back up, she had absorbed it, the way she absorbed everything that mattered deeply, completely, and without display. Tell him, she said quietly, that his mother thinks about him every day too, and that he should eat properly. He never eats properly when he is working hard. I smiled for the first time in longer than I could remember. I'll tell him. She finished her coffee and stood buttoning her coat with the careful attention she gave to small tasks when she was holding something larger together beneath the surface. At the door, she turned back once. Arthur, she said, whatever he does next, I need you to know that I am not afraid. I trust you. I have always trusted you. She paused. Just don't make me wait too much longer. The pantry situation is becoming genuinely dire. I was still smiling when she walked out the door and back into the October morning. Upright and unhurried. Her coat collar turned up against the wind, moving through the falling leaves of Garland Street, with a dignity that Julian Sterling, for all his calculations, had never once come close to understanding. I left money on the table and called Thomas. How soon on the 3rd creditor? I asked when he picked up. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe less. Good, I said. Be ready. The call came on a Wednesday night in November 1143 by the clock on the hotel nightstand, which meant it was 8:43 in Seattle, and Thomas was still in his office, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he was taking this. My younger son kept precise hours when things were going smoothly, and forgot to go home entirely when something required his full attention. The fact that he was calling from his office at nearly 9 in the evening meant the 3rd creditor had moved. I picked up on the first ring. His face appeared on the screen, looking the way it always looked when he had been working long hours, which was focused and slightly rumpled with the particular alert quality around his eyes that Eleanor had always called his father's expression, and that Thomas had always denied inheriting. He was 44 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who had done physical work before he did desk work, and he had Eleanor's way of looking directly at you when he spoke steady and without evasion. "It's done," he said. "All three. As of this morning, I am the primary creditor on every outstanding business obligation Julian has that required an external guarantor." He paused. "Combined exposure is $430,000. He has no idea." I set the phone on the desk and leaned back in my chair. Outside the hotel window, Pembroke Avenue was quiet at this hour, just the occasional headlights moving past in the dark. $430,000 in debt, entirely in the hands of his younger brother and Julian, was sitting in my house drinking whatever was in my liquor cabinet and congratulating himself on his own cleverness. "Walk me through the structure," I said. Thomas pulled up something on his own screen, a document I could not read from the angle of his camera, but could see he knew by heart. Creditor 1 was a commercial lender out of Phoenix who held a note on Julian's restaurant venture from 2019. I bought the note at 60 cents on the dollar. They were happy to be rid of it. He scrolled down. Creditor 2 was a private equity group in Atlanta who had extended a bridge loan for the Riverside development project that fell through in 2022. Bought that one at 55 cents. Again, no resistance. "And the third was the one that took time," Thomas said, and something in his voice shifted slightly, the way a voice shifts when a person is about to say something that costs them more than the words suggest. "The third was the bank where Dad co-signed Julian's operating line in 2017, the one for $300,000. I had known this creditor was in the portfolio. I had told Robert to flag it when I first identified Julian's debt structure 18 months earlier. But hearing Thomas say the number out loud in his quiet and careful voice landed differently than reading it in a document. "The bank required more negotiation," Thomas continued. "They wanted to understand why a private buyer was interested in a performing loan with a cosigner of your standing. I told them the cosigner was retiring his guarantor relationships for estate planning purposes and had arranged for the debt to be transferred to a family holding entity." He looked directly at the camera. "That is technically accurate." "It is," I said. "Robert will confirm the paperwork on our end this week." Thomas nodded. He set his own phone down on the desk and looked at me with an expression that reminded me unexpectedly and sharply of the way he had looked at 14 when he came to me in my study to tell me something he had been carrying for weeks. That particular combination of directness and the awareness that what he was about to say could not be unsaid. "Dad," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "Always," I said. "Have I waited long enough?" His voice was measured, but the effort behind the measurement was audible. "Because I have watched Mom get smaller for 8 months. I have watched the footage Robert sends me every 2 weeks. I have seen the grocery account and the $40 and the way she moves through that house like she is trying not to take up too much space." He stopped for a moment. "I am not a patient man by nature. You know that. I have been patient because you asked me to, and because I trust your judgment more than I trust my own instincts. But I need to know how much longer she has to live like that before we move." I had prepared an answer to this question. I had rehearsed a version of it in the hotel room on 3 separate evenings, the measured explanation of why timing mattered, why the final move had to be Julian's and not mine, why patience was not the same thing as indifference. I had the argument fully constructed and ready. I did not use it. "Not long," I said instead. "He's getting careless. When a man believes he has already won, he stops being careful about how he wins. Julian is at that stage. I can see it in the footage. The way he moves through the house now is different from the way he moved through it in March. He stopped performing. And when he stops performing, Thomas said, he makes the mistake I've been waiting for, I said. Something documented, unambiguous, and legally indefensible. When that happens, Robert moves within 24 hours. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his jaw working slightly, the way Eleanor's did, when she was deciding how to say something. I'm not doing this for the house, he said finally. I want you to know that. The house can burn to the ground for all I care. I'm doing this because Mom stood outside in the rain for 7 hours and nobody inside opened the door. He paused. Wait, that hasn't happened yet. No, I said quietly. It hasn't. The silence between us held the weight of something that had not yet occurred, but that both of us could already see coming the way a judge can sometimes see the shape of a verdict before all the testimony is in. Thomas looked at me through the screen from his office in Seattle, and I looked back at him from my hotel room on Pembroke Avenue, and neither of us said what we were both thinking, which was that the moment we were waiting for was going to hurt before it was over. Be ready, I said. When I call it will be fast. I've been ready for 8 months, Thomas said. Call me the second it happens. He ended the call. I set the phone on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling of the hotel room for a long time, listening to the quiet of Pembroke Avenue outside, thinking about Eleanor on Sycamore Drive 3 miles away, and about the shape of what was coming, and about the particular loneliness of a man who can see exactly where a story is going and cannot move any faster than the story itself will allow. 2 months later, on a cold evening in January, Julian Sterling gave me everything I had been waiting for. Robert Vance arrived at the Hargrove Inn on the morning of January 7th, with a leather briefcase I had not seen before. Dark burgundy and trim, the kind of case an attorney carries when the contents require a container that communicates their seriousness before anyone opens it. He set it on the small table by the window, ordered coffee from room service, without asking whether I wanted any, and sat down across from me with the composed expression of a man who had been preparing for this meeting for 14 months. It's complete, he said. Everything. He opened the briefcase and removed a folder thick and bound with a dark red cover, the kind of presentation binder his office used for final case documentation. He set it on the table between us and kept his hand on it for a moment, before sliding it across the way a man pauses before placing the last piece of a structure that has taken a long time to build. I opened it. The table of contents alone ran to 3 pages. Robert had organized the documentation into 7 sections, each tabbed and color-coded, with the particular thoroughness of a man who had spent 3 decades anticipating the objections of opposing counsel. Section 1 held the original trust instrument and all amendments with Marcus Allen's competency certifications. Clipped behind each signature page, 41 weeks of assessments in total, everyone signed, dated, and notarized. Section 2 held the property transfer documentation. Eleanor's name on the deed in clean black type recorded with the county assessor's office on November 19th of 2023. Section 3 was the one that took me the longest to get through. It contained 847 time-stamped footage clips, organized chronologically, and cross-referenced with a written log that Robert's paralegal had compiled over 14 months. Every clip had a 1-sentence description, a timestamp, a camera number, and a column marked legal classification that Robert had filled in himself. The classifications read like a catalog of Julian's worst qualities rendered in legal language. Financial isolation of a dependent elder. Destruction of personal property belonging to a co-resident. Verbal conduct consistent with psychological elder abuse. Denial of access to shared household resources. I had seen all of this footage before, clip by clip, evening by evening, in the chair by the hotel window. But reading it compiled and classified and presented in the flat, precise language of a legal document was a different experience entirely. It was the difference between watching a storm through a window and reading the meteorologist's report afterward. The report did not make the storm worse. It made it permanent. 847, I said. 847 documented incidents, Robert confirmed, over a period of 9 months and 12 days. The financial abuse alone, the joint account manipulation, and the systematic reduction of Mrs. Sterling's personal funds meets the threshold for civil action under elder financial abuse statutes in this state. The footage of the verbal incidents on October 3rd and November 9th would support a criminal referral if you chose to pursue one. I'm not pursuing criminal action, I said. I want him out of that house. I want Eleanor back in it. I want it done through the trust mechanism my father, which is to say, myself, designed specifically for this purpose. Robert nodded. Then we have more than enough to trigger the protective clause. The trust language requires documented evidence of exclusionary conduct directed at Eleanor. We have 9 months of it. Any court in this state would look at this folder and tell you the trigger threshold was crossed before the summer was out. I turned to Section 4, which held the financial documentation on Julian's debt structure. Thomas's name appeared on the cover page as the acquiring creditor, his holding company listed below it in smaller type. The total exposure figure, $430,000, was printed in the summary box at the top right corner with the particular clarity of a number that has been confirmed from multiple sources and is not going to change. Robert, I said without looking up from the page, if I move today with this folder right now, what happens? I file the trust violation notice with the county recorder this afternoon, he said. Eleanor, as property owner, sends formal notice to Julian that his occupancy is terminated effective 30 days from today. If he refuses to vacate, we file for a court-ordered removal. Given the documentation, I would expect the court to move quickly. He paused. Julian's attorney, whoever he hires, will review this folder and advise him that his position is legally indefensible. Most attorneys in this situation advise their clients to negotiate a departure rather than fight a battle they cannot win. I closed the folder and set my hands flat on the cover, the dark red surface cool beneath my palms. I'm not moving today, I said. Robert looked at me across the table without surprise because he had known me for 31 years and had learned that my decisions once made were not made impulsively and were not reversed by impatience. Tell me why, he said. Because 9 months of footage showing a man behaving badly inside a house is documented misconduct, I said. But it is misconduct that a skilled attorney could frame as a difficult family situation, a dispute about household management, a conflict between generations living under one roof. Unpleasant, possibly actionable, but arguable. I looked at Robert. I want something that is not arguable. Something that happens outside the house in the cold, in front of a camera, to a woman who is 70 years old and has never in her life done anything to deserve it. Something that Julian does with full deliberate intent, and that he cannot later claim was a misunderstanding. Robert was quiet for a long moment. The room service coffee sat untouched between us, going cold. You think he'll lock her out? Robert said. It was not a question. I think he's been moving toward it for 9 months, I said. The account restriction was a test. The verbal incidents were a test. Every time he pushed a boundary and found no resistance, he moved the next boundary further. I picked up the red folder and held it for a moment before handing it back across the table. I want you to take this back to your office. Lock it in your best safe. In less than 2 weeks, Julian Sterling is going to give us the last page of this document. And when he does, I want to be ready to move within 24 hours. Robert took the folder and returned it to the burgundy briefcase with the care of a man handling something that had taken a long time to build and would not need to be built again. I'll keep my calendar clear, he said. He left 20 minutes later. I stood at the window and watched his car pull out of the Hargrove Inn parking lot onto Pembroke Avenue, the burgundy briefcase on the seat beside him, carrying everything that Julian did not know existed. 6 days, I thought. Give him 6 days. He needed 4. The cardiology appointment had been scheduled for 3 weeks, a routine follow-up that Dr. Reeves at St. Brendan's Medical Center required every quarter to monitor the arrhythmia that Marcus Allen managed between visits. I had told no one at the house about it, which was not unusual. I had told Julian and Chloe very little about my medical schedule since March, partly because it was none of their concern, and partly because a man who spent 40 years on the bench learns to keep information segregated from people whose relationship to that information he does not fully trust. The appointment ran long, the way appointments at St. Brendan's always ran long in January, when the waiting rooms were full, and the staff was managing 3 times the patient volume of a normal week. By 2 in the afternoon, I was in a monitoring room with leads on my chest and a nurse named Patricia telling me that Dr. Reeves wanted an extended observation period before he signed off on my quarterly clearance. I asked to use my phone. Patricia told me the monitoring equipment required all devices to be powered down during the session. She said it with the particular firmness of a hospital professional who has explained this policy to resistant patients more times than she could count. I powered the phone down at 2:15 in the afternoon. I would not power it back on until 10:47 that night. What I am about to tell you, I did not witness directly. I reconstructed it afterward frame by frame from the footage that Robert's server had been archiving since the previous March from the phone records that his paralegal subpoenaed 3 days later, and from Eleanor's account, which she gave me in a quiet voice at the hotel the following morning, sitting in the chair by the window, with both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that she kept forgetting to drink. At 2:32 in the afternoon, Eleanor left the house on Sycamore Drive to walk to the pharmacy on Henderson Road 4 blocks away. She had a list. Blood pressure medication for me, a refill of her own prescription, and a box of the chamomile tea she ordered through the pharmacy because Julian had decided that personal deliveries to the house were an inconvenience and had canceled her online accounts without asking. The smart lock system on the front door of the house on Sycamore Drive operated through a touchpad panel and a companion application on a designated administrator device. I had installed the system 18 months earlier and registered 3 authorized users: myself, Eleanor, and at Eleanor's request, Julian, so that he could let himself in when he came to visit before any of this had begun. At 2:41 in the afternoon, 9 minutes after Eleanor left for the pharmacy, Julian opened the administrator application on his phone and removed Eleanor's access credentials from the system. Her fingerprint profile, her personal entry code, and the backup key fob she kept on her keychain were all deactivated in a single session that the system logged with the precision of a device that does not understand the human weight of what it is recording. The log entry read, User E, Sterling Access Credentials Removed. Administrator Action, 2:41 p.m. Eleanor returned from the pharmacy at 3:17. She pressed her thumb to the touchpad, and the panel flashed red. She tried her entry code, and the panel flashed red again. She stood on the porch for a moment, her pharmacy bag in one hand, and then took out her phone and called Julian. He declined the call. She called again. He declined it again. She called a third time and a fourth and a fifth, standing on the front porch of the house where she had lived for 40 years, while the January sky darkened and the temperature dropped, and the first rain began to come in sideways off the ridge to the west. The system log on Julian's phone recorded each call. Declined, 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 declined. Inside the house, the camera in the upstairs hallway captured Julian walking from the master bedroom to the kitchen at 3:22, 5 minutes after Eleanor's first call, his phone in his hand, his face carrying the expression of a man who has made a decision and is not experiencing any difficulty with it. He set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. He poured himself a drink. He stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out at the backyard, and then walked back toward the living room without once looking toward the front of the house. Chloe appeared in the kitchen doorway at 3:31. The camera captured her looking at Julian's phone on the counter, then at Julian, who had settled into the couch in the living room with the television on. The audio captured her voice clearly. "Is that Eleanor calling?" she said. "Reception issue," Julian said without looking up from the screen. Chloe stood in the doorway for 4 seconds. Then she walked back into the kitchen, picked up her own phone, and began scrolling through it. She did not call Eleanor. She did not walk to the front door. She stood at the kitchen counter with her phone and did nothing, and the camera recorded every second of it with the indifferent accuracy of a machine that has no opinion about what it sees. Eleanor called 11 more times over the next 4 hours. Julian declined every one. The system log preserved each declined call with its timestamp, its duration of 0 seconds, and the single word that the application used for the action Julian performed each time with his thumb on the screen. Declined. At 7:44 in the evening, Eleanor's phone battery died. The calls stopped. On the front porch of the house on Sycamore Drive in the rain and the cold of a January night that had dropped to 31 degrees, my wife of 43 years sat down on the top porch step with her pharmacy bag in her lap and her back against the front door, and waited for someone to notice she was there. No one came. At 9:26, she lost consciousness. At 10:47, I powered my phone back on in the lobby of St. Brendan's Medical Center, waiting for a cab, and watched the screen fill with notifications that I did not yet understand. I stepped outside into the rain and raised my hand for a cab, and the night air hit me like a verdict I had not seen coming. The cab turned onto Sycamore Drive at 10 minutes past 11, and I saw the porch light before I saw anything else, that single yellow circle falling across the front steps, the way it had fallen across them for 40 years, unchanged and indifferent to everything that had happened beneath it. Then I saw Eleanor, and the world reduced itself to that one image with the particular totality that only happens when the mind encounters something it was not prepared for, despite having spent 2 years preparing for everything. She was on the floor of the porch. Her back was against the front door. Her knees were drawn up toward her chest, and her head had fallen to one side, and the pharmacy bag was still in her lap, the white paper handles dark and limp with rain. She had kept hold of it. Even unconscious in the cold and the dark, she had kept hold of the pharmacy bag because she had gone out to get medication, and she intended to bring it home. That detail broke something open in my chest that I did not have a name for. I was out of the cab before it stopped. My knees took the porch steps badly, and I did not care. I was on the floor beside her with my fingers at her throat before I had consciously decided to move, checking her pulse the way Marcus Allen had taught me 30 years ago when Eleanor had a health scare that turned out to be nothing, and I had decided that a man who did not know how to check his wife's pulse was a man who was not paying adequate attention to the things that mattered. She was alive. Her pulse was slow, and her skin was the temperature of the concrete beneath her, and her lips had gone the color of ash in the porch light. But she was alive, and her chest was moving. And when I said her name close to her ear, her fingers tightened slightly against the pharmacy bag. The front door opened. I had known it would. I had known Julian would open the door because a man who has spent the evening declining his mother's phone calls and watching television does not spend the night in a state of active worry. He opens the door when he hears movement on the porch, comfortable in the assumption that whatever is out there is a problem someone else will manage. He was in a dry shirt. He had a glass of bourbon in his right hand. The warm light of the entryway fell out around him, and across Eleanor on the floor, and he looked down at her with the expression of a man who is recalculating rapidly and without success what the correct performance for this moment should be. "Dad," he said, "I didn't know she was out there. I thought she was upstairs." I looked up at my son from the floor of the porch where his mother lay unconscious. I looked at the bourbon. I looked at the dry shirt. I thought about the system log on his phone, about 2:41 p.m., and the word declined appearing 15 times in sequence, each one a choice he made with his thumb and without hesitation. I thought about Eleanor at the kitchen table counting $40. I thought about the bookshelves I had built with my own hands, disassembled with a cordless drill on a Saturday afternoon, while I watched from a hotel room 3 miles away. I thought about 43 years of a woman who had never once in her life done anything to deserve what this man had done to her in the last 10 months. I thought about all of it in approximately 3 seconds, which is the amount of time a man who has spent 40 years on the bench needs to reach a verdict he has already been building for 2 years. "Understood," I said. "Goodbye, Julian." His face moved through 4 distinct expressions in rapid succession, the way a face moves when the response it prepared is no longer adequate for the situation it has encountered. He had expected argument. He had expected tears, possibly, or the particular pleading anger of an old man who has been outmaneuvered and knows it. He had not expected 2 words delivered in the same tone I had used to pronounce sentences from the bench for 38 years, the tone that communicates not emotion, but finality. I gathered Eleanor carefully, one arm beneath her knees and one behind her shoulders, and I stood with her the way I had stood with her across the threshold of this same house in the spring of 1982, when she was 29 years old, and the future was unwritten, and the oak trees out front were young enough to see over. She was lighter than she had been then. That fact registered somewhere very deep and very quiet in the place where a man keeps the things he will not allow himself to feel until the work is finished. The cab driver had gotten out. He held the rear door open without being asked, and did not say a single word as I carried Eleanor down the porch steps and across the wet lawn, and I was grateful for his silence in the way a man is grateful for exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. I settled Eleanor against my shoulder in the back seat. The cab pulled away. I did not look back. I asked the driver for his phone. He handed it over the seat without turning around. Robert picked up on the second ring. "Robert," I said, "it's time. Open everything." 2 seconds of silence. Then in the voice of a man who had been waiting 14 months for this sentence, "I'll be ready by morning." I handed the phone back and looked down at Eleanor. Her color was already slightly better in the warmth of the cab. Her breathing had steadied. Her hand had found my arm in the dark, and her fingers pressed against my sleeve with a grip that was weaker than it should have been, but present and deliberate, and entirely Eleanor. Outside, the rain kept falling on Sycamore Drive. Behind us, the porch light of the house went dark as Julian closed the door on what he believed was his victory. He had 4 days left to believe it. I did not sleep. Eleanor slept, which was the important thing. The hotel doctor I called at midnight, a compact and efficient man named Dr. Farrell, who made house calls for the Hargrove Inn at rates that suggested this was not an unusual service, examined her thoroughly, and told me that she was suffering from mild hypothermia and exhaustion, that her vitals were stable, that she needed warmth and rest and fluids, and nothing more dramatic than that. He said it with the careful reassurance of a man who understood that the person asking the question needed a clear answer more than he needed comfort. I appreciated that. I sat in the chair by the window after he left and watched Eleanor sleep and listened to the rain against the glass and let myself feel for approximately 20 minutes everything I had been compressing into a manageable shape for the past 14 months. It was not a pleasant 20 minutes, but it was necessary the way lancing a wound is necessary. And when it was over, I poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon from the minibar, drank it slowly, and picked up my phone. Robert answered on the first ring, which told me he had not slept either. "The bank filings," I said. "All 3. Submitted at 6 this morning," he said. I drove to the office at 5 and filed them electronically the moment the submission window opened. The guarantor withdrawal notices will hit Julian's accounts within 4 to 6 business hours. He paused. Thomas confirmed the debt transfer documentation is countersigned and on file. As of this morning, Julian's primary creditor on all 3 outstanding obligations is his younger brother. I let that sit for a moment. $430,000 in debt, and the man holding the notes was Thomas Sterling, who had spent 8 months being deliberately invisible while Julian dismissed him as irrelevant. The architecture of it pleased me in the way that a well-constructed legal argument pleases a man who has spent his life building them, not with pride exactly, but with the quiet satisfaction of seeing a structure hold its weight. "Eleanor?" Robert asked. "Sleeping," I said. "She'll be fine." "Good." His voice carried the particular relief of a man who has been holding to something carefully for a long time and has just been told he can set it down. "Arthur, I want to say something, and I want you to let me finish before you respond." "Go ahead." "You were right to wait," he said. "I told you 8 months ago that you had enough to move. I was correct legally. But what Julian did last night is not something any attorney he hires will be able to reframe as a family disagreement or a generational misunderstanding. The smart lock log, the 15 declined calls Eleanor unconscious on that porch, all of it time-stamped and camera documented. That is not a difficult family situation. That is elder neglect with a paper trail that a first-year law student could follow. He paused again. I did know what he meant. I had heard him call me by my own father's name twice before in 31 years, always in moments of high stress, always as a compliment, because my father had also been a careful and precise man, and Robert had admired him. I let it pass. At 9 o'clock I called Thomas. He picked up immediately, his voice carrying the alert quality of a man who had been awake and waiting. "How is she?" he said before I could speak. "She'll be fine," I said. "She's sleeping." I heard him exhale a long, slow breath that carried 8 months of compressed worry in it. "Okay," he said. "Okay." He said it twice, the second time quieter than the first, the way a person says a word when they are using it to anchor themselves rather than to communicate information. "The debt transfer is confirmed," I asked. "Confirmed and documented," he said. "All 3 creditors. If Julian tries to refinance or restructure any of those obligations in the next 30 days, every institution in this state will see Thomas Sterling as the primary note holder. He cannot move money without my knowing about it." He paused. "When do you want me there?" "Not yet," I said. 3 days. Robert needs to prepare the notice documents, and I want them served in person at the house with Harris present. I paused. Julian needs to see all of it arrive at once, not piece by piece. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "He's going to be scared," he said, and his voice had something in it that was not satisfaction and was not sympathy, but lived somewhere in the complicated space between the two. "Yes," I said, "he is." At 10 o'clock, Eleanor woke up. I heard her stir and crossed to the bedroom doorway. She was sitting up against the pillows, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking at the hotel room with the careful attention of a woman orienting herself in an unfamiliar space. When she saw me in the doorway, something in her face settled. "Arthur," she said. Her voice was rough from the cold, but steady. "Good morning," I said. I brought the coffee I had ordered and sat on the edge of the bed and handed her the cup, and she took it with both hands and drank slowly, and for a moment neither of us said anything, because there was too much to say, and the morning was still too new to hold all of it at once. "Is it done?" she asked finally. "It has started," I said. "3 more days." She nodded, looking down at the coffee cup. Then she looked up at me with an expression I had not seen on her face since the early years of our marriage, when we were young enough to believe that the difficult things we were walking toward together were adventures rather than trials. "Then let's have breakfast," she said. "A real one, with eggs." I smiled. For the first time in 4 days, I smiled without anything complicated underneath it. Across the city at the house on Sycamore Drive, Julian's phone was beginning to light up with notifications from 3 different banks. I was not watching when it happened. I was sitting across a breakfast table from Eleanor, who was working through a plate of scrambled eggs with the focused attention of a woman who had not eaten a proper meal in longer than either of us wanted to calculate. And I was drinking my 3rd coffee of the morning and feeling for the first time in 14 months something that resembled the ordinary texture of a Tuesday. Robert called at 11:47. "You need to see this," he said, and his voice carried the particular compression of a man who is trying very hard not to sound pleased. "Julian is live streaming from inside the house. He has been for the past 20 minutes. I'm sending you the link now." Eleanor looked up from her eggs. I held the phone so she could see the screen beside me as the link loaded. Julian had positioned himself in what used to be my study, standing in front of the large flat-screen television that he and Chloe had installed where my bookshelves used to stand. He was wearing a pressed shirt and had his hair arranged with the careful casualness of a man who wants to appear effortlessly comfortable. Behind him, the room was lit with the warm, deliberate lighting of someone who has thought about how a space should look on camera. Chloe moved in the background, adjusting a throw pillow on the leather sectional that now occupied the space where my reading chair had stood for 30 years. "Good morning, everyone," Julian was saying to the camera with the broad, easy smile of a man addressing an audience he expects to admire him. "I know a lot of you have been asking about the new place, so I figured why not give you a little tour. We've been doing some renovating, freshening things up." He spread his hands to indicate the room behind him. "This used to be a kind of storage situation. Dark, a lot of old furniture, a lot of clutter. We opened it up, brought in some light, made it actually livable. Storage situation. Dark. Clutter." I looked at the screen and thought about the 40 years of case files and annotated opinions that had lived in that room. I thought about the bookshelves I had built over 2 weekends in 1982 with a handsaw and a level that consistently lied to me. I thought about the framed citation from the American Bar Association that had hung above the desk since 1994, now propped against a garage wall beside a broken lawn chair. Eleanor set her fork down carefully on the edge of her plate. "He's very pleased with himself," she said in the tone she used when she was being precise rather than unkind. "He won't be in approximately 4 minutes, Robert said from the phone. Eleanor authorized the utility disconnection order at 9 this morning in her capacity as the property's legal owner of record. The service company confirmed the cutoff window as 11:30 to noon. I watched the screen. Julian had moved to the kitchen, gesturing at the new pendant lights Chloe had installed over the island in November, explaining to his audience that good lighting was the single most underrated element of interior design. He said this with the authority of a man who had never once in his life thought about interior design before acquiring a house that belonged to someone else. At 11:51, the pendant lights went out. Not gradually. All at once, the way power goes when a cutoff order is executed at the source rather than the breaker. The kitchen plunged into the gray mid-morning light coming through the windows, and Julian stopped mid-sentence with his mouth open and his hand still raised toward the now dark pendant fixtures, frozen in the particular posture of a man whose performance has been interrupted by something he cannot immediately explain. "Huh," he said to the camera to the 1,100 people watching. "That's weird. Must be a breaker." He walked toward the hallway. The camera, which Chloe was apparently holding, followed him. He opened the breaker panel in the hallway closet and stood looking at it for a moment. Every breaker was in the correct position. Nothing had tripped. The panel was entirely normal because the issue was not in the panel. The issue was at the street where the utility company had executed a disconnection order signed by the legal owner of the property. Julian pulled out his phone and called the utility company. Eleanor and I listened to the hold music through the phone speaker, thin and tinny, while Chloe moved the camera around the darkened kitchen with the uncertain energy of a person who does not know what to do when the situation has moved outside the script. When the utility representative came on the line, Julian gave the address and explained that the power had gone out without warning. There was a pause while the representative checked the account. Then the representative said that the disconnection had been processed that morning per a request from the account holder of record. "I'm the account holder," Julian said. His voice had shifted, the broadcast ease gone, replaced by something tighter and more careful. "The request was submitted by the property owner of record," the representative said. "I'm showing the owner of record as Eleanor Sterling. The disconnection was authorized by Mrs. Sterling at 9:14 this morning." The silence that followed lasted 6 seconds. I counted them. Chloe lowered the camera. The live stream showed the kitchen ceiling for a moment, then a section of darkened floor, and then the feed cut entirely as Julian ended the broadcast from his own phone. 1,100 viewers watched the screen go black. Julian stood in his darkened kitchen in the house that had never belonged to him, and the sound of his breathing was the only thing the camera microphone picked up in the final 2 seconds before the feed died. He called Eleanor's number 4 minutes later. She looked at the incoming call on her phone, then at me, and pressed the red button without a word. "Robert," I said into my own phone. 2 more days." "Everything is ready," Robert said. "Harris confirmed this morning. We'll be there at 9. Eleanor picked her fork back up and returned to her eggs with the composure of a woman who had decided that scrambled eggs deserved her full attention, and that Julian Sterling had already received more of it than he had earned. Robert sent me the bank notification, confirmations at 2:17 in the afternoon, 3 separate emails arriving within 4 minutes of each other, each one from a different institution, each one confirming that the guarantor withdrawal had been processed and that the associated credit facilities had been flagged for immediate review. I read them at the small desk in the hotel room, while Eleanor rested in the bedroom with the curtains drawn against the winter afternoon light, and I felt the particular quiet satisfaction of watching a structure perform exactly as it was designed to perform. At the house on Sycamore Drive, Julian was having a different experience entirely. I know this because the cameras were still running, still routing their footage to Robert's server with the same indifferent precision they had maintained since the previous March. I did not watch the footage in real time that afternoon. I reviewed it that evening once Eleanor was asleep, sitting at the desk with the laptop open and the volume low, moving through the timestamps, the way I had moved through thousands of case files over 40 years, methodically and without hurry. At 2:23, Julian sat down at the kitchen table with his laptop and opened his primary business banking application. The camera above the refrigerator captured his face clearly. He logged in, waited for the page to load, and then sat very still for approximately 8 seconds, which is a long time for a man who does not normally sit still. His operating line of credit, the $300,000 facility that I had co-signed in 2017 and that Thomas had quietly acquired from the bank 11 days earlier, showed a status of suspended pending guarantor review. The credit limit had been reduced to 0 while the review was processed. Any pending transactions drawing on that facility had been declined. Julian closed the laptop. He opened it again immediately, as though the information might have changed in the 2 seconds the screen had been dark. It had not changed. He closed it a second time and sat with his hands flat on the table, his jaw tight, staring at the kitchen wall, with the expression of a man trying to calculate something that is not calculating correctly, no matter how many times he runs the numbers. He called his bank at 2:31. I could not hear the conversation from the camera audio, but I could read his face as it progressed the initial controlled politeness. The shift to something more insistent, the moment when he received information that caused him to press 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose and close his eyes briefly. He ended the call and immediately dialed a second number. That call lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, Julian stood up from the table so quickly that the chair scraped back against the tile floor with a sound the audio captured clearly. He walked to the kitchen window and stood there with his back to the camera, his shoulders carrying the particular rigidity of a man holding himself together through effort rather than ease. Chloe came downstairs at 3:15. She had changed out of the clothes she had been wearing during the live stream and was carrying her phone with both hands, scrolling through something with the focused attention of a person doing research they are not enjoying. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at Julian, who was still standing at the window. 3 law firms, she said. I called 3. The first one said they needed to review the trust documentation before they could advise. The second one said they didn't handle estate disputes of this nature. She paused. The third one asked if the trust had been established by a former federal judge, and when I said yes, they said they would call back. Julian turned from the window. His face had the stretched quality of a man who has spent several hours being calmer than he feels, and is reaching the limit of that effort. They won't call back, he said. How do you know? Because I know how this works, Julian said, and his voice carried something I had not heard in it before, not in 10 months of footage, which was the specific flatness of a man who has begun to understand the shape of what is happening to him and does not yet know what to do with that understanding. Chloe set her phone down on the counter with a deliberate care that suggested she was making a decision about how to proceed. Julian, she said, I need you to tell me honestly. How bad is it? He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the January afternoon had gone the gray color. It goes in the middle of winter when the light gives up early and the dark comes in from the edges of the sky. In the house on Sycamore Drive without electricity, that gray light was all there was. The operating line is suspended, he said. Both secondary accounts are flagged. The Phoenix note has a new holder I don't recognize, and the Atlanta bridge loan shows the same. He stopped. Someone has been buying my debt. Chloe's face underwent a change that the camera captured with uncomfortable clarity. It was not the change of a woman receiving surprising information. It was the change of a woman receiving information she had been half expecting and had been hoping would not arrive in this particular form. Thomas, she said. It was not a question. Julian did not answer. He turned back to the window. The gray afternoon light fell across his face, and he looked for the first time since March, like a man who was not entirely certain of where he stood. That evening, he sent me a text message. It read, I know what you're doing. This is harassment and extortion, and my attorney will be in touch. I read it once. I set the phone face down on the desk beside the laptop and looked at Eleanor's closed bedroom door and thought about what Robert had said that morning. Then I picked up the phone, and for the first time in 4 days, I smiled at something Julian had done. He still thought he had an attorney. Julian sent 4 more messages before midnight. I know this because Robert forwarded them to me the following morning with a cover note that read in its entirety, saving all of these. They are gifts. The messages escalated in the particular way that messages escalate when the person sending them is not receiving the responses they require to regulate their own anxiety. The first was the threat about attorneys I had already read. The second, sent 40 minutes later, informed me that he had spoken with a real estate attorney who had confirmed that the trust was almost certainly challengeable on procedural grounds. The third, arriving just after midnight, dropped the legal language entirely and became something more personal, accusing me of orchestrating a campaign of harassment designed to humiliate him in front of his family and his business associates and whatever 1,100 people had been watching his live stream when the lights went out. The fourth message was the shortest. It read, "Dad, call me. Please." I did not respond to any of them. In 40 years on the bench, I had observed more times than I could count the particular dynamic that emerges when a person who is accustomed to controlling a situation loses that control and must decide how to respond. Some people become aggressive. Some become conciliatory. Some oscillate between the two with a speed that makes it difficult to predict which version will appear next. Julian. I had determined over 10 months of careful observation was an oscillator. He would threaten, then soften, then threaten again, each cycle moving him further from the rational assessment of his actual position and deeper into the emotional reaction that would prevent him from preparing an effective defense. The silence was not cruelty. The silence was strategy. Every message he sent unanswered was a message he sent without information, and a man acting without information makes decisions that serve the person watching rather than himself. Eleanor and I had breakfast again at the small table by the hotel window, which had become, in the 2 days since she had asked for eggs, something that felt almost ceremonial in its ordinariness. She had color in her face that had not been there on the night I carried her from the porch, and she had eaten enough at dinner the previous evening that I had stopped counting her bites, which was something I had been doing without realizing it since the night at Birchwood Coffee when I had noticed how thin she had become. She was reading the newspaper when Julian's name appeared on my phone screen for the 3rd time that morning. I turned the phone face down on the table without looking at the message. Eleanor glanced at the phone, then at me, and returned to the newspaper without comment, which was one of 10,000 small ways she had spent 43 years communicating that she understood me without requiring me to explain myself. "Robert called while you were in the shower," she said without looking up from the page. "He said Harris confirmed 9 o'clock tomorrow." "Good," I said. "He also said that the real estate attorney Julian claims to have spoken with does not appear in any bar association directory under the description Julian provided." She turned a page. "Robert thinks Julian invented him." I looked at my wife across the breakfast table. This woman who had spent 10 months eating crackers for dinner and counting $40 at a kitchen table that someone had told her was no longer hers, who was now sitting in a hotel bathrobe reading a newspaper and casually dismantling her son's legal strategy between sips of tea, and I felt the particular fullness that a man feels when he is in the presence of someone who has never once in 43 years failed to be exactly who he needed her to be. "I married well," I said. She looked up at me over the top of the newspaper. "You married extremely well," she said. "Don't forget it." I called Robert at 10. "Harris," I said. "Tell me about Harris." "Captain Darnell Harris," Robert said. 22 years on the force, the last 6 as a precinct captain. He was in your courtroom in 2008 as a junior detective on the Whitmore case. You wrote him a commendation letter when the department tried to sideline him over a procedural dispute. He asked me to tell you he has not forgotten it. Robert paused. He also asked me to tell you that he reviewed the trust violation documentation last night, and that in his words, he has served eviction orders on people with considerably less cause than this, and considerably more documentation than most. He understands his role, I said. He's there for the legal authority, not for the relationship. He understands completely, Robert said. He'll be in uniform. He'll present the order, confirm the legal basis if Julian demands it, and ensure that the service of notice is properly witnessed. Nothing more. He paused. Arthur, how are you? It was the first time in 14 months that Robert Vance had asked me that question directly, without it being embedded in a status update or a legal briefing. I sat with it for a moment. Tomorrow, I said. Ask me tomorrow. He laughed, which was something Robert Vance did approximately 3 times a year and always briefly. Tomorrow then, he said. 9 o'clock. I set the phone down and looked out the hotel window at Pembroke Avenue in the thin January sunlight, the first sunlight in 4 days falling across the wet pavement, with the tentative quality of something that was not yet sure it was welcome. Across the city, 3 miles away, Julian Sterling was sitting in a dark house composing messages that no one was going to answer and waiting for a response that was not coming in any form he would recognize. Tomorrow it would come in the only form that had ever mattered. A knock on the door, a man in a gray suit and 40 years of preparation arriving exactly on schedule. Before I reveal the ultimate showdown and the heavy price this ungrateful son had to pay, please comment on the number 430, the exact debt he didn't know his younger brother held, so I know you are still here watching. And please note, the following story includes some fictional elements and may not be completely factual. If you do not wish to hear it, you may turn off the video right here. We arrived at Sycamore Drive at 3 minutes past 9. Robert had driven. I sat in the passenger seat with the red folder on my lap, the same burgundy briefcase on the back seat behind me, and I watched the oak trees on the street pass by the window, the way I had watched them from cab windows and car windows, and my own driver's seat for 40 years. The same trees, the same curve of the road, the same orange circle from the streetlight on the corner that now looked pale and unnecessary in the thin morning light. Beside Robert's car, Captain Darnell Harris pulled his department vehicle to the curb in full uniform, his posture carrying the particular uprightness of a man who takes the weight of his office seriously every single time he puts it on. I had asked Eleanor to stay at the hotel. She had agreed without argument, which told me she understood that what was about to happen was not something she needed to witness in person. She had already witnessed the part that mattered. She had witnessed it alone in the rain for 7 hours, and that was enough. Robert and I walked to the front door. Harris fell into step slightly behind us, and to the right, present and visible without being aggressive, the way a man with legal authority moves when he wants the authority to speak before he does. I carried nothing. The red folder was in Robert's hands. Julian answered on the second knock. He had clearly been awake for some time. His shirt was the same one he had been wearing in the camera footage from the previous afternoon, and his eyes carried the particular rawness of a man who has been staring at a phone screen in a dark house waiting for responses that never came. When he opened the door and saw Robert in his gray suit and Harris in his uniform, and me standing behind them both, his face moved through 3 expressions in approximately 2 seconds. Confusion first, because he had been expecting, if anything, a phone call. Then recognition the moment he identified Robert Vance and understood why an attorney and a police captain had arrived together at 9 in the morning. Then something that was not quite fear but was close enough to it that the distinction did not much matter. Chloe appeared behind him, almost immediately drawn by the sound of the door, and I watched her eyes move across the 3 of us with the rapid assessment of a woman who had spent her marriage calculating odds and had just calculated these and found them very poor. "Julian," Robert said. His voice was the voice I had heard in courtrooms and conference rooms and across desks for 31 years, precise and unhurried, and carrying the particular weight of a man who knows exactly what he is holding. I have a formal notice for you regarding the property at this address. He held out the red folder. I would recommend you read it before responding. Julian took the folder the way a man takes something he does not want to accept, but cannot refuse without appearing to know why he should refuse it. He opened it and looked at the first page. His lips moved slightly as he read. I watched his face. I had watched a great many faces in 40 years. I had watched the faces of men who had committed fraud, read the evidence against them for the first time. I had watched the faces of people who had believed themselves to be protected discover that they were not. I had developed over those 40 years a particular facility for reading the precise moment when a person's internal narrative about their own situation makes contact with an external reality that does not confirm it. It is not a dramatic moment usually. It is quiet. It is the moment when the face stops performing and simply registers. That moment came for Julian Sterling on the third paragraph of the first page. His jaw tightened. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The hand holding the folder shifted its grip, the knuckles whitening briefly before he consciously relaxed them. "This is a notice to vacate," he said. His voice was flat and careful, in the way of a man choosing each word as he arrives at it. "You're telling me to leave my own house. I'm telling you to vacate a property you do not own," Robert said. "The legal owner of record is Eleanor Sterling, whose access credentials you removed from the entry system on the afternoon of January 13th, while she was absent from the premises. She subsequently spent 7 hours in freezing temperatures on the front porch of her own home and lost consciousness before being discovered. That action constitutes a documented violation of the property trust and triggers the mandatory vacate provision. You have 30 days. Julian looked at Harris. "And you're here because—" Harris met his gaze with the steady patience of a man who has delivered difficult news to difficult people for 22 years. "I'm here to serve as a witness to the formal service of this notice," he said, "and to inform you that the documentation attached to that folder includes phone records showing 15 declined calls from Eleanor Sterling to your number during the hours she was outside. Willful failure to render aid to a vulnerable adult is a criminal matter in this state. Whether that avenue is pursued is not my decision today. But I want you to understand that it exists." Chloe's hand found the doorframe. Her fingers pressed against the painted wood, and I watched the color leave her knuckles the way color leaves a face when the body redirects its resources. Julian looked at me. For the first time since March, he looked at me not as the elderly father he had decided to manage, not as the obstacle he had spent 10 months removing, but as something closer to what I actually was. His face held the expression of a man trying to locate the moment when the situation had moved outside his control, and finding to his considerable distress that he could not identify it because it had never been inside his control at all. "You planned all of this," he said. His voice had gone quiet, not soft, quiet in the way that a room goes quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. I looked at my son for a long moment. I thought about the lemon cookies Eleanor had set out the day he arrived. I thought about 43 years of a woman who had loved him without condition, and $40 a week, and a kitchen that someone had told her was no longer hers. "No," I said. "You planned this. The moment you removed her credentials from that system, you wrote the last page of a document I had been hoping for 2 years I would never need to use." I paused. "I simply made sure there were consequences." Julian opened his mouth. He closed it again. Beside him, Chloe had stopped looking at me and was looking at Julian with an expression that I recognized because I had seen it in courtrooms more times than I could count, on the faces of people who have just understood that the person standing next to them has made decisions that are now also their consequences to carry. Robert said, 30 days, Julian. The clock started this morning. I turned and walked back down the porch steps to the car without looking back. Behind me, I heard the door close, not slammed, closed quietly by a man who had run out of performance and had nothing left to offer the morning but the sound of a latch catching. The first attorney Julian hired reviewed the trust documentation for 72 hours and returned the retainer on the fourth day with a letter that Robert forwarded to me without comment. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph cited a conflict of interest as the reason for withdrawal. The second paragraph, which Robert had underlined in pencil, noted that the trust instrument had been constructed with a level of procedural precision that the firm did not believe could be successfully challenged in the current legal environment, and that the client would be best served by exploring alternative arrangements. Alternative arrangements meant leaving. Julian did not explore alternative arrangements. He hired a second attorney, a younger man from a firm downtown that specialized in family disputes and real estate contestation, who agreed to review the documentation for a flat fee before committing to representation. That review took 6 days. On the 7th day, the attorney called Julian and told him that he would not be taking the case. Julian called Robert to demand an explanation. Robert told him politely and without elaboration that he was not in a position to explain the decisions of other attorneys and that the 30-day clock continued regardless. The second week brought a different kind of pressure. Julian began calling Thomas. I know this because Thomas told me each time it happened with the careful precision of a man who understood that the information was relevant and that I needed to hear it without editorializing. The first call was civil, almost brotherly Julian, suggesting that perhaps Thomas did not fully understand the situation and that a conversation between the two of them, without attorneys or police captains present, might clear up the misunderstanding. Thomas listened to the entire call without interrupting, and then said in the measured tone he used when he had thought something through completely before speaking, that he understood the situation very well and that the debt obligations Julian owed to his holding company were due in full upon demand, and that he would be in touch regarding repayment terms. Julian hung up. The second call came 3 days later and was not civil. Julian used language I will not reproduce here, accused Thomas of betraying the family for money, and demanded to know how much Arthur had paid him to participate in what Julian was now calling a coordinated scheme to defraud a family member of his rightful inheritance. Thomas waited for the call to finish, which took 4 minutes, and then said 2 things. The first was that Julian had never had a rightful inheritance in the house on Sycamore Drive, because the house had been titled in Eleanor's name for 14 months before Julian moved into it, which meant Julian had been residing in someone else's property without permission for the entire duration of his occupancy. The second was that Thomas would be arriving in person on the 28th day to discuss the debt repayment schedule and that Julian should have his financial documentation ready. Julian did not respond. He ended the call. On the 18th day, Julian appeared at the Hargrove Inn. I was not there when he arrived. I was at Robert's office reviewing the final transfer documentation. Eleanor was in the hotel room, and she called me at 11:40 in the morning with the particular steadiness in her voice that she used when she needed to tell me something without alarming me. Julian is in the lobby, she said. He asked the front desk to call up. I told them I would come down. Eleanor, I said. I know, she said. I'm not going down. I told the front desk I wasn't available, but I thought you should know he came. I drove back to the hotel. By the time I arrived, Julian was gone. The front desk manager, a composed young woman named Denise, told me that the gentleman had waited in the lobby for 40 minutes, had asked twice more to be announced, and had eventually left without incident. She described him as appearing, in her words, very tired. I thought about that on the elevator ride up. Very tired. Julian Sterling, who had spent 10 months moving through my house with the confidence of a man who had already won something, looking very tired in a hotel lobby where his mother had declined to see him. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something closer to the particular exhaustion that follows a long and necessary effort, the feeling a surgeon might have after a difficult procedure that went correctly, and not celebration, but the quiet acknowledgement that the thing that needed to be done had been done. On the 22nd day, Julian came to the hotel again. This time I was there. He found me in the small sitting area near the elevator, where I had been reading and waiting for Eleanor to finish a phone call with Thomas. He looked worse than the front desk manager's description had prepared me for. He had lost weight in the particular way that stress takes weight from a man from the face first, and then the shoulders, and his clothes carried the slightly unfocused quality of a person who has been dressing without paying attention to what he is putting on. He sat down across from me without asking whether he could, which was, I supposed, consistent. "Dad," he said, "I need to talk to you." "I'm listening," I said. I set my book down. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped in front of him, and looked at the carpet between his feet for a long moment before looking up. When he did, his eyes were red at the edges, in the way that eyes get when a person has been sleeping badly and crying intermittently and does not want to acknowledge either. "I need you to stop this," he said. "I'm asking you, father to son, whatever I did, whatever you think I did, I'm asking you to stop this and let us talk about it like a family." His voice broke slightly on the word family, and he pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment, visibly pulling himself back. "Chloe left," he said, "3 days ago. She took her things and went to her sister's, and she said she wasn't coming back until this was resolved. I am sitting in that house alone without power or water, and I have no money that isn't frozen, and I have 2 attorneys who won't return my calls." He looked at me. "Dad, please." I looked at my son and felt the full weight of what he was asking me to feel, because I am his father, and 40 years of love does not evaporate because of 10 months of betrayal, and I want to be honest about that too. It was not simple. It was not the clean, uncomplicated satisfaction that stories sometimes suggest it should be when justice arrives at its destination. It was complicated, and it hurt in the way that things involving your children always hurt, regardless of what those children have done. But I thought about Eleanor at the kitchen table with $40. I thought about the pharmacy bag still in her hands when I found her unconscious on the porch. I thought about 15 calls, each one declined with a thumb in the rain and the dark and the cold, while the woman who had loved him without condition sat on the floor of her own home and waited for her son to open a door. "Julian," I said, "the night your mother stood outside for 7 hours, the night she called you 15 times and you declined every call. When you were sitting in that living room pressing that button on your phone, did you think about this moment? Did you think about sitting across from me someday and asking me to stop?" He did not answer. His jaw worked. His hands tightened against each other. "I didn't think you did," I said, "because if you had thought about this moment, you would have opened the door." I picked up my book. Robert has the documentation for an agreed departure. If you sign it before the 30th day, certain aspects of the criminal referral become considerably less likely to proceed. I would suggest you call him. I paused. "And Julian, call your mother. Not to ask for anything, just to call her." He sat there for another minute after I looked back at my book, and I could feel him trying to find something else to say, some argument or appeal that would change the architecture of what had already been built. There was nothing. He stood up eventually and walked toward the elevator, and I heard it open and close, and then the sitting area was quiet again, with the ordinary quiet of a hotel on a weekday morning. Thomas arrived 2 days later. He came to the hotel first before going to the house, and sat with Eleanor and me at the small table by the window for an hour drinking coffee and talking about his firm and a project he was designing in Portland, and the way the light came into his office in the early morning when the clouds were low. He asked Eleanor whether she had been eating properly. She told him she had been eating extremely well and that he should mind his own business. He laughed in the way he always laughed, the way Eleanor laughed, from somewhere lower than the throat, and the hotel room held that sound for a moment, with the particular warmth of a family that has been through something difficult and is still, despite everything, a family. Then he drove to the house on Sycamore Drive and knocked on the door. He was there for 40 minutes. He did not tell me everything that was said, and I did not ask. What he told me was that Julian had signed the debt acknowledgement and agreed to the repayment structure, which, given the size of the obligation and Julian's current financial position, meant that a formal bankruptcy filing was the only realistic outcome. He also told me that Chloe had not returned and that Julian, when Thomas left, was sitting alone in the kitchen of the dark house with a single candle on the table and a look on his face that Thomas described carefully and without pleasure as a man who had finally understood something he should have understood a long time ago. The 30th day fell on a Saturday. February 15th arrived, the way significant days sometimes do, quietly and without announcement, indistinguishable from the outside from any other Saturday morning, except for the particular clarity of the light and the way my hands were steady when I buttoned my coat at 8 o'clock in the hotel room, while Eleanor sat at the small table finishing her tea. She had been awake before me. I had found her already dressed when I came out of the bathroom, her coat on the chair beside her, her key in her hand, turning it slowly between her fingers, the way she turned things over when she was thinking. She did not look anxious. She looked like a woman who has been waiting for something for a long time and has finally reached the morning of it. Harris was already at the curb on Sycamore Drive when we arrived. Robert pulled in behind us a minute later, and the four of us stood on the sidewalk in the cold February air for a moment without speaking, which felt appropriate. Some mornings do not require preamble. I had asked Eleanor to stay in the car until it was finished. She had agreed, and then she had not agreed, and we had reached a compromise that involved her sitting in the passenger seat, with the window down, which was her way of being present, without being in the way, and which I had accepted, because 43 years of marriage had taught me the precise boundaries of the arguments worth having. Julian came to the door at 9 o'clock. He had a single suitcase and a cardboard box. He was wearing his coat. Harris walked to the door alone the way we had arranged, and I stood beside the car with my hand on the roof and watched from the distance I had decided was correct for this moment. The conversation on the porch lasted 3 minutes. Julian did not raise his voice. Harris did not raise his. At one point, Julian looked past Harris's shoulder directly at me, and I held his gaze for a moment before he looked away. And that was the entirety of what passed between us on that final morning. He carried his suitcase down the steps himself. He set the cardboard box on the back seat of a car I did not recognize, a blue compact that had been idling at the curb since before we arrived, driven by someone I could not see clearly. He did not look at Eleanor. He did not look at Thomas, who had arrived on foot from the corner and was standing 20 feet away with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching. Julian got into the passenger seat, pulled the door closed, and the blue compact moved away from the curb and drove to the end of Sycamore Drive and turned left and was gone. Thomas came and stood beside me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. The oak trees at the end of the block held the morning light, the way they always had in February, bare and clear and honest, and the street was quiet, except for a neighbor's dog barking once somewhere behind the Hendersons' house, and then going still. "Okay," Thomas said finally. It was the same word he had said when I told him Eleanor was safe after the hospital, said the same way quietly, and to himself like an anchor dropping. Eleanor was already out of the car. She walked to the front porch the way she had walked to it 10,000 times before, without hurry, with the particular attention she gave to familiar things that deserved to remain familiar. At the top step, she stopped, took her key from her coat pocket, and put it in the lock. The door opened. She stepped inside without looking back. Thomas and I followed her. The house had been emptied of Julian and Chloe's furniture, cleared by Harris's officers during the inventory process the previous week. And what remained was the structure of the place itself, the walls and floors, and the light coming through the windows at the angles I had known for 40 years. It smelled of nothing in particular, which was its own kind of absence. Eleanor stood in the center of the living room and looked at the bare mantelpiece above the fireplace at the small marks on the wall where the wedding photograph had hung for 3 decades. She reached into her coat pocket. She had carried the photograph there all morning. I realized the same way she had carried her key. She placed it back in the brackets above the fireplace with both hands, adjusting it, once stepping back to check the level, adjusting it again. When she was satisfied, she lowered her hands and looked at it for a long moment. "There," she said. "Now it looks right." Thomas set down the box he was carrying and went back out to the truck for another. I crossed the room and stood beside Eleanor and looked at the photograph with her. We are young in it, standing in her parents' garden in the summer before we were married, and Eleanor is laughing at something I said. A moment before the shutter opened, her face turned toward mine. I am not looking at the camera. I never looked at the camera when Eleanor was in the room. I put my arm around her shoulders. She leaned against me slightly, the way she had leaned against me for 43 years, with the particular ease of a person who has found the right place to stand and does not need to think about it anymore. That evening, Thomas drove back to his hotel and Eleanor made tea in the kitchen, and we sat beneath the light fixture she had refused to replace for 40 years because it still worked perfectly, and she saw no reason to change what was not broken. The house settled around us the way houses do when the right people come back to them quietly and without ceremony. Eleanor wrapped her hands around her mug. "Arthur," she said. "Eleanor," I said. She smiled across the table at me, and it was the same smile. It had always been unchanged by everything that had come after the garden in 1981. And I reached across and covered her hands with mine, and we sat there in the kitchen of the house on Sycamore Drive, while the February dark came in through the windows, and the tea went slowly warm between her palms. Julian had lost the house, but that was never the point. The point was the key in her pocket, and the photograph above the fireplace, and Eleanor's footsteps moving through the rooms again, filling the space the way they were always meant to. I spent 40 years believing that the law was the most powerful tool a man could hold. I still believe that. But I learned something in those 14 months that no case file ever taught me. Patience, when it is rooted in love rather than pride, is not weakness. It is the most precise instrument available. I am not a perfect father. I want to say that plainly, because this family story deserves honesty more than it deserves a hero. I waited too long before I understood what Julian had become. I told myself it was strategy. Some of it was. Some of it was the particular blindness that fathers carry toward their own sons, the hope that outlasts the evidence. If you see that blindness in yourself, do not wait as long as I did. Open your eyes before someone you love is standing in the rain. I believe God gives certain people the clarity just to prepare for what others refuse to see coming. I am grateful I was one of them. I am more grateful that Eleanor was standing at that fireplace when it was over. These grandpa stories, these family story moments that change everything quietly, they are the ones worth telling. If this family story reached something in you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you stay for more grandpa stories like this one, subscribing takes 1 second and means more than you know. Thank you for staying until the end. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements crafted purely to explore the things that matter most. If that is not what you came for, no hard feelings at all. Choose what serves you best, and we will be here when you are ready.